The morning Stuart Cromwell read the will, Adeline Bancroft noticed his hands. He was a careful man by nature, methodical in the way that comes from decades of delivering news that changes people's lives, and his hands were usually steady. But that morning, holding the 3 pages of Sylvester Bancroft's last testament across the long conference table, Stuart's fingers pressed into the paper with more force than the task required. Not the grip of a man reading, the grip of a man who had argued against something and lost. Adeline noticed that. She noticed most things. She was sitting alone on her side of the table. Across from her, Merton, Agatha, and Baxter had arranged themselves with the quiet coordination of people who had rehearsed the morning before it arrived. Each of them had brought a private attorney. 3 lawyers for 3 siblings, all carrying leather portfolios, all wearing the composed expressions of people who expected good news. They had coordinated their black clothing without consulting Adeline, which told her everything she needed to know about how the weeks ahead were going to feel. But it was the lawyers that stayed with her. 3 attorneys for a routine will reading in a modest office in downtown Gloucester, Massachusetts. People did not hire private counsel for surprises. They hired private counsel when they already knew the shape of what was coming and wanted protection inside it. Adeline had come alone. Stuart cleared his throat and began with the procedural language, the validity of the instrument, the testamentary process, the date of signing. His voice was even, his hands were not. Sylvester Bancroft's estate had been valued at approximately $7.4 million. The house in Gloucester assessed at $1.9 million. Investment accounts totaling roughly $4.2 million. Retirement funds and miscellaneous assets making up the remainder. Adeline felt her shoulders drop with something that was almost relief. She had not realized until that moment how tightly she had been holding herself. 38 years. Sylvester had always provided. There was no version of this where she was left without security. She told herself that as Stuart turned to the next page. Then he kept reading. The Gloucester property in its entirety to Merton, Agatha, and Baxter Bancroft to be divided or sold at their discretion. The investment accounts split equally among the 3 children. The retirement funds, same distribution. Adeline watched the numbers disappear one by one. Each sentence landed somewhere in the middle of her chest, not loud, not dramatic, just solid and final like stones dropping into water. She heard her own voice come out very quietly. Stuart, what did Sylvester leave for me? Stuart looked up from the document. The expression on his face was one she would not forget for the rest of her life. It was the look of a man who had been on the losing side of a long argument and had never made his peace with it. He read the relevant passage word for word. Sylvester had written in language that was precise and deliberate and unmistakably his own, the measured cadence of a man who chose every word as if choosing from a limited supply. He stated that Adeline had been adequately provided for throughout their marriage, that she had enjoyed a standard of living well beyond her own earning capacity, and that her role in the household had been one of domestic management rather than true partnership. Domestic management. Across the table, Merton was already straightening his papers. Agatha had her phone out, not looking at it, just holding it as if she needed something in her hand. Baxter stared at the wall behind Adeline's head, unable or unwilling to meet her eyes. Stuart slid a small brown envelope across the table. His hand, Adeline noticed again, was not entirely steady. Inside was an iron key worn smooth in places from years of use and a card in Sylvester's handwriting. 12 words, 9 Lakeridge Road, Clover, New Hampshire. Go there. You will understand when you arrive. Adeline picked up the envelope. She stood. She walked out of the office without speaking to any of them. She did not know yet why a man who had loved her would write those words into a legal document. She did not know yet what the key opened, or what the house in Clover contained, or what 30 years of monthly trips to a town she had never heard of meant. She only knew one thing with any certainty as she pushed through the glass door of Stuart Cromwell's office building and stepped into the cold February air. A man as careful as Sylvester Bancroft did not leave a key and a handwritten address as an afterthought. If that envelope was all he had left her, it was because that envelope was everything. She would understand it when she arrived. That question, quiet and persistent as a current beneath still water, carried her through everything that came next. To understand why Sylvester Bancroft did what he did, why a man who loved his wife would write those particular words into a legal document, and why he would spend 30 years building a secret that was also a gift, you have to go back to Portland, Maine in the spring of 1986. Adeline Harmon was 28 years old that year, and she had spent the previous 3 years moving between administrative jobs along the Maine coast, competent enough to be hired quickly, quiet enough that nobody thought to promote her. She was the kind of woman who remembered every detail, who kept things running without being asked, who could read a room the moment she walked into it and understand what it needed before anyone else had named the problem. None of her employers had noticed this. They had noticed that their filing was done correctly and their schedules ran on time, and they had attributed these results to the systems rather than to the person maintaining them. She walked into the offices of Bancroft Financial Group on a Thursday afternoon in May, looking for steady work and a reason to stop worrying about rent. Sylvester Bancroft was 47. He had built his financial consulting firm from nothing over 2 decades, and it showed in everything about him: the way he stood, the way he moved through a room, the particular stillness of a man who had stopped being surprised by his own success. He was tall, silver-haired earlier than most, and he spoke in complete sentences that arrived exactly where he intended them to. No wasted words, no unfinished thoughts. Adeline was hired as his office manager that same Thursday. By the following Monday morning, she had reorganized the firm's entire filing system into a structure that actually reflected how the attorneys worked rather than how someone had thought they should work 20 years ago. She had identified 3 billing errors that had been sitting unnoticed in the accounts for months, and she had quietly resolved a scheduling conflict between 2 senior staff members that had been generating low-grade tension for weeks, accomplished entirely through 2 brief private conversations and a single calendar adjustment without either person knowing the other had been spoken to. Sylvester noticed. He did not say anything immediately. He was not a man who commented on competence as though it were surprising, but 6 months later he asked her to lunch at a small restaurant on Commercial Street, and Adeline understood that the invitation meant something more than it said on its surface, because Sylvester Bancroft did not do anything without a purpose. He proposed 14 months after that at a restaurant on the Maine coast, where the fog was rolling in off the water and the candles on the table were losing their fight against the draft from the door. Adeline said yes without hesitation. She loved him. She believed he loved her the same way back. She was right about both of those things. She would spend a long time later sorting out where the complications lived inside what was also true. His 3 children from his first marriage were adults by the time of the wedding, or close enough. Merton was 24, already working at the firm, already watching everything with the particular quality of attention that had nothing to do with admiration and everything to do with inventory. Agatha was 21, polished in the way some people are when they have never been told no about anything that mattered to them, which is to say she was perfectly gracious in a way that contained no warmth. Baxter was 18, quiet and resentful in the manner of a boy who had decided early on a story about his life and was committed to it. He had made up his mind that Adeline was the reason his parents' marriage had ended, despite the fact that Sylvester and his first wife had separated 2 full years before Adeline ever walked through the door of Bancroft Financial Group. The wedding was held on a Saturday in late October at a small venue outside Gloucester. The day was cold and clear, the kind of New England autumn afternoon that looks beautiful in photographs and feels even better in person. And Adeline had been genuinely happy in the hours leading up to the moment near the end of the reception when Agatha found her. She was standing near the window with a glass of water, watching the last of the light go off the lawn when Agatha appeared at her elbow. She was smiling. She held a glass of champagne the way she held everything, as though it were slightly beneath her, but she was too well-bred to say so. "I want you to know," Agatha said, "that we don't blame you personally. You seem perfectly nice. But this family has a way of doing things, and that's not going to change just because you're here now." She walked away before Adeline could respond. Adeline stood there with the noise of the reception around her and the evening light fading on the lawn beyond the glass, and she understood clearly what had just happened. She had been informed in the most civil language available that she would always be an outsider in this family, that the door had been decided upon before she arrived, that no amount of effort or competence or genuine love for their father would change the geography of where she stood. She made a decision in that moment. She chose not to believe it. That was the thing about Adeline Bancroft. She was not naive. She understood exactly what Agatha had said and why she had said it and what it meant for the years ahead. She simply decided, standing there in her wedding dress with the reception noise around her, that she was going to live as though the door was open anyway, as though her presence in this family was legitimate and permanent and worth building toward. It was the right decision and the costly one, and for 38 years she held to it without ever fully reckoning with what it had asked of her. She learned the rhythms of Sylvester's life and built her own around them. They lived in the colonial house in Gloucester that he had owned since the late 1970s, a large home 2 blocks from the water with a back garden that caught the afternoon light beautifully. She managed the household accounts and coordinated the maintenance and repairs and planned every dinner party and holiday gathering with the kind of attention that made everything look effortless, which it never was. She was present for Merton's wedding and the birth of his 2 children. She attended all 3 of Agatha's wedding ceremonies, 2 of which ended in divorce, and said nothing unkind about either husband. When Baxter's car broke down the morning of his first real job interview and there was no one else he could call, Adeline drove him there herself, waited in the parking lot, and never mentioned it to him again, or to Sylvester, or to anyone. Sylvester was good to her in the ways that were visible. He never raised his voice. He provided a comfortable life. He told her she was beautiful on her birthdays and on their anniversaries, with the reliability of a man fulfilling a commitment he had made to himself and taken seriously. He took her opinions on the business seriously. He laughed at her jokes. He reached for her hand in the dark when the nights were difficult. But there was a door he kept closed, not metaphorically. An actual door at the end of the second-floor hallway of the Gloucester house, the room he used as a private study. Adeline had never been inside it. Very early in their marriage, before they had been husband and wife for 6 months, Sylvester had asked her quietly to respect that space, and she had, without pushing, without demanding an explanation, because she was a woman who understood that some things were not hers to take simply because they lived under the same roof. She had always told herself that the closed door meant nothing, that it was simply the private architecture of a man who had built everything in his life before she arrived and needed some corner of it to remain his own. She had believed that, or had chosen to believe it, which is not quite the same thing, but serves the same purpose. And once a month, without exception, for the entirety of their marriage, Sylvester traveled alone. He always had a reason: a client meeting in Boston, a conference somewhere up the coast, a property matter that required his personal attention. Adeline packed his bags and kissed him goodbye and trusted him completely, because that is what you do when you have decided that your marriage is worth believing in. She planted roses in the back garden of the Gloucester house that grew over the years into something genuinely beautiful. A deep red climbing variety trained along the back fence herbs in the corner, with the best afternoon light beds of perennials that came back faithfully every spring. She cooked thousands of meals in that kitchen. She sat beside Sylvester at fundraising dinners and charity events and smiled at people who looked straight through her to the man she was standing next to. She built a life that was by every external measure a success. Then on a Tuesday morning in February, she brought Sylvester his coffee at 7 o'clock, as she had done for nearly 4 decades, and found that he had died in his sleep. The cup was still warm when the paramedics arrived. His heart, the doctor said. Fast, no warning, no suffering. Adeline stood in the doorway of their bedroom and felt the particular disorienting silence of a house when the person who gave it its shape is suddenly gone. The walls were the same. The furniture was the same. The morning light came through the windows in exactly the same way it had come through every morning for 38 years. But the shape of the air was different, hollowed out at the center in a way she had no language for. She did not know yet that the silence had another layer to it. The funeral was held 10 days later on a Saturday at the church in Gloucester, where they had attended services for most of their marriage. The turnout was larger than Adeline had expected, though she could not have said afterward why this surprised her. Sylvester had spent 4 decades building a reputation across New England, and the people who came to the church reflected that: former clients and business partners, colleagues from half a dozen firms, local officials whose campaigns he had quietly supported over the years. The pews filled completely. People stood along the back wall. Merton, Agatha, and Baxter sat in the front row with their spouses and children, arranged like a carefully composed portrait of family grief. They had coordinated their black clothing without discussing it with Adeline. She had discovered this when she arrived at the church and saw them already seated, already unified in a way that made her placement in the second row feel less like oversight and more like statement. Merton had handled the seating arrangements. When Adeline saw where her name card had been positioned, she stood at the end of the pew for a moment. Then she sat down without a word. 3 people delivered eulogies. A longtime business partner spoke about Sylvester's discipline and his instinct for long-term thinking. A former client talked about his integrity. Baxter spoke last, and he cried in a way that seemed genuine, his voice unsteady as he described his father's quiet strength and the standards Sylvester had held himself to throughout his life. Nobody mentioned Adeline. Not once across 3 separate eulogies did anyone acknowledge the woman who had shared Sylvester Bancroft's life for 38 years. Not her name, not her presence, not the meals she had cooked, and the household she had run, and the thousand small acts of care she had performed every day of those 38 years without being asked. It was not an accident. That was the thing that Adeline understood as she sat in the second row and listened. 3 different people, 3 separate speeches, and not one of them had made a single reference to her. That kind of omission does not happen by accident. It happens because someone at some point made sure it wouldn't. At the reception afterward, held at Merton's house in Manchester by the Sea, Adeline was walking through the front room when she heard Agatha's voice carrying from the direction of the window. She was not trying to listen. She was simply moving through the space looking for somewhere quiet to stand. But Agatha's voice had a particular quality when she wanted to sound composed and also wanted to be heard, a controlled projection that carried further than she probably intended. "We just have to get through the next few weeks," Agatha was saying to a small group of women near the window. "Once the estate is settled, we can all move forward. The 3 of us finally get to make decisions about our family's future without having to navigate around anyone else." Adeline kept walking. She found her coat. She waited another 20 minutes out of courtesy and then left. The will reading was scheduled for the following Thursday. Adeline dressed that morning in a dark gray wool dress and was careful with her appearance in the way you are when you are trying to feel more prepared than you actually are. She told herself on the drive downtown that there was nothing to be afraid of. She told herself that 38 years meant something legally as well as morally. She told herself that Sylvester had always provided and that there was no version of this morning where she left without security. Her hands were steady on the steering wheel. She had been sleeping badly for 10 days, waking at 3 in the morning with her mind already running calculations she could not stop. But that morning she felt oddly calm because she had decided there was nothing to be afraid of. She was wrong, and she was also in a way she would not understand until much later exactly right. The rest of the morning played out the way it played out. The conference table, the 3 attorneys, the careful seating. Stuart Cromwell's voice reading numbers that added up to a life Adeline had helped build, and then one by one those numbers being assigned to other people. The language about domestic management, the specific cold precision of it, words chosen to wound in a way that could not be dismissed as carelessness. And then the envelope, the iron key, the 12 words in Sylvester's handwriting. 9 Lakeridge Road, Clover, New Hampshire. Go there. You will understand when you arrive. She walked out of Stuart Cromwell's office, saw Sheffis into the February cold, and stood on the sidewalk for a moment before going to her car. The sky was low and gray. The harbor was a quarter-mile away, and she could smell the salt on the wind. She got into the car. She sat for a moment before starting the engine. A man as careful as Sylvester Bancroft did not leave a key and a handwritten address as an afterthought. A man who had spent 30 years traveling to the same place every month, who had kept a private room in their house for 38 years, who had built a legal instrument precise enough to wound in exactly the places it intended. That man did not leave a rusty key in 12 words as a consolation. He left them as a door. And Adeline Bancroft, 66 years old, 2 suitcases, and 20 days away from losing the only home she had known since she was 28, reached across the passenger seat and picked up the small brown envelope and held it in both hands. She would go. She would drive to Clover, New Hampshire, and she would find out what the key opened, and she would understand when she arrived because Sylvester had told her she would, and whatever else was true about the man she had spent 38 years loving, he had never once told her something that wasn't. She had 20 days left in the only home she had known since she was 28 years old, and she spent the first of them sitting in the car in the driveway. Not crying, not yet. The shock was still too clean and too complete for tears sitting in her chest like something solid that had displaced the air. The bare February trees moved in the wind off the water. The harbor smell came through the vents even with the engine off. She had driven this driveway so many thousands of times that her hands knew the turning radius by feel, and now she sat at the end of it and watched the house she had managed and maintained and quietly loved for nearly 4 decades, and tried to understand that it was no longer hers. 30 days from the date of Sylvester's death, Stewart had told her that on her way out of his office, his voice low, the words delivered like a second blow he had no choice but to land. She had used 10 of them already. 20 remained. She went inside and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window looking at the back garden, at the rose beds dormant under the February cold, at the climbing to varieties she had trained along the back fence, one careful season at a time. Then she went upstairs and began to make a list of what she would take when she left. Merton called that evening. His voice had the quality of someone who had thought carefully about tone before dialing calibrated to a neutrality so precise it communicated effort. They wanted to give her a day before reaching out, he said. He understood this was difficult, but they needed to discuss the timeline for the house. They had spoken with a real estate agent, and she had suggested that the sooner the property could be listed, the better position they would be in for the spring market. Adeline told him she understood the 30-day timeline and intended to use every day of it. There was a pause on his end. Not long, just long enough to register displeasure without giving her anything she could respond to directly. Of course, Merton said. Take your time. They began coming to the house 3 days later. Merton arrived first on a Wednesday morning with a contractor she had never met. He walked through the rooms with a measuring tape in one hand and a legal pad in the other, speaking in the clipped shorthand of men discussing structural possibilities, load-bearing walls and open floor plans, and what the kitchen might look like if the island were repositioned. Adeline was sitting 12 feet away at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. Merton moved through the space with the focused efficiency of someone conducting an assessment, noting dimensions, asking questions, making marks on his pad. He did not acknowledge her presence. Not once in 40 minutes did he make eye contact, offer a greeting, or indicate in any way that he was aware he was standing in a room where someone was sitting. Adeline held her coffee with both hands and watched him work. The contractor stepped out through the back door to look at the garden. Merton followed. Adeline could see them through the kitchen window, the contractor gesturing toward the rose beds, toward the climbing varieties, against the fence, toward the herb garden she had built in the corner with the best afternoon light. She watched the contractor point and speak, and Merton nod and write on his legal pad. She could not hear the words through the glass, but she understood the gesture. The contractor's hand moved across the beds in a sweeping motion that meant removal, not preservation. Merton wrote something down. Adeline set her coffee cup on the table very carefully and did not look out the window again. Agatha came the following afternoon, and she came alone. No designer, no contractor. Just Agatha in a dark coat with her hair pulled back, standing in the entrance to the living room and looking at the space with an expression Adeline recognized from the wedding 35 years ago and from every family gathering since. It was the expression of a woman conducting an appraisal, measuring the distance between what something was and what it could be worth. Adeline was standing at the kitchen sink when she heard footsteps on the hardwood. She dried her hands and came into the doorway between the rooms. Agatha turned. The smile arrived a half second after the eye contact, which is where you can always tell. I wanted to talk about the photographs, Agatha said. She gestured toward the built-in shelving on either side of the fireplace at the framed photographs arranged there among the books. The ones on the mantel, the ones on the cabinet in the kitchen. These things belong to the family, and I want to make sure they're handled appropriately before you go. Adeline looked at the photographs. There was their wedding picture on the mantel of Sylvester in a dark suit, Adeline in ivory. Both of them turned toward each other in the particular way of people who have just made a decision they mean. There were photographs of the children at various ages, Christmas mornings and graduations. And there were photographs of Adeline and Sylvester together at dinner parties and on the front steps of this house, 20 years of ordinary life accumulated in frames. Your father's wedding photographs, Adeline said. Our father's, Agatha said gently. And obviously you're in them, but you understand what I mean. Adeline looked at her directly. No, she said. I don't think I do. It was a very small thing. 4 words delivered without heat. But Agatha had been calibrating conversations with Adeline for 35 years, based on the expectation of a particular kind of response, something accommodating, something that smoothed the surface and moved past the friction, and Adeline did not give her that response. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her stepdaughter and waited. Agatha held the eye contact for a moment, then she looked away first. I'll come back another time, she said. She left without taking any of the photographs. Adeline remained at the kitchen doorway after the front door closed. She was not angry. Anger was too warm for what she felt. It was something colder and more clarifying, a kind of assessment of her own, a ledger being settled in her mind that she had kept open for too long. The nights were the worst part. She would lie in the bedroom she had shared with Sylvester for nearly 4 decades, and her mind would run the same calculations over and over, arriving at the same conclusions each time. She was 66 years old. She had no income of her own. Her employment history had a 38-year gap that no employer was going to look past. She had $240 in a personal checking account she had opened 3 years ago and almost never used. She had the clothes in her closet and the books on her shelves and the contents of the boxes she had been slowly filling in the spare bedroom. And she had an iron key in a brown envelope and an address in a town she had never heard of in a state she had no particular connection to. Some nights the fear was precise enough to have a physical shape pressing at her ribs from the inside. Other nights it shifted into something harder and hotter. Not quite rage, but adjacent to it, a burning awareness of what had been done to her and by whom and over how many years. She had given 38 years of her life to a household and a family that had never fully accepted her presence. And the man who had asked her to do that had wrapped the explanation in a legal document with the words domestic management and left her a rusty key as recompense. On those nights, the anger was not only at Merton and Agatha, it was at Sylvester. And that was the anger she had not yet found a place to put. 8 days before she was due to leave, she was standing at the kitchen sink rinsing a coffee cup when she heard their voices in the hallway. The kitchen door was half open. Merton and Agatha were not whispering. They had perhaps forgotten she was there, or perhaps they had simply stopped caring. "The Clover property is probably a wreck," Agatha said. "Dad mentioned it once years ago. Some old lake house inherited from a relative. He said it wasn't worth the property taxes." Merton's voice measured and assured, "Sell it for $50,000 if she's lucky. That buys her what? 2 years." They both laughed, not loudly, just enough. Adeline set the coffee cup down on the counter. She dried her hands on the dish towel. She walked upstairs and continued packing, and she did not stop until midnight. And she did not think about the conversation again, because thinking about it was not the same as being prepared for what came next. She left Gloucester on a Thursday morning in early March, 29 days after Sylvester died. 2 suitcases, 3 boxes. 2 of the boxes held things that had belonged to her before the marriage. Photographs of her parents, letters, books her mother had given her over the years. The 3rd box held the wedding photograph she had taken from the mantel the night before, wrapped in a dish towel because she had nothing else to wrap it in, and she was not leaving it for strangers to throw away. Merton arrived at 8:30, 30 minutes before she had planned to leave, and stood in the driveway with his hands in his coat pockets while she carried boxes to the car. He did not offer to help. He stood with the patient stillness of a man waiting for something to conclude, and Adeline moved around him the way water moves around a stone, without acknowledgement, without friction, without giving him anything to respond to. She backed out of the driveway and turned onto the street and did not look in the rearview mirror. Not because she could not, because she had decided she would not. The drive from Gloucester to Clover, New Hampshire took just under 3 hours, cutting northwest through the state on roads that became quieter and narrower the further she went from the coast. The highway gave way to state roads, and the state roads gave way to 2-lane roads lined with white pine and birch that still held snow in the shadows where the sun had not yet reached. The sky was pale and high, the particular flat gray of early March in New England that is not quite winter anymore, but will not admit to being anything else yet. Adeline drove with the radio off. The brown envelope sat on the passenger seat beside her purse, Sylvester's handwriting facing up. She had looked up Clover 2 nights before leaving. Population just under 2,000. A general store, a diner, a post office, a small library, a church, and a lake called Ember Lake that appeared in satellite images as a wide gray-blue oval set into the surrounding forest, like something placed there deliberately. The town had no reviews on any travel sites she could find. That meant it was a place people lived in rather than visited, which meant Sylvester had not been going there for the scenery. Her GPS took her off the main road onto a county route, then off that onto a smaller road that curved along the southern edge of what she realized was the lake. She could see the water through the trees, flat and still in the March light, the surface holding the color of the sky. She found herself leaning slightly forward in the driver's seat to see more of it. The GPS directed her left onto Lake Ridge Road, paved for the first quarter mile, before transitioning to packed gravel that announced itself under the tires. The trees on either side were old-growth, white pine mixed with oak and maple, tall enough and thick enough that the road felt less like a road and more like passage through something, a corridor between one version of the world and another. Then the trees opened without warning, and Adeline stopped the car. The house was stone, gray fieldstone with lighter mortar lines, 2 stories with a steep roof and wide eaves, and a covered porch that ran the full length of the front face, looking directly out at the water. The porch railings were painted white recently enough that the paint still held its clarity. The windows were tall and divided into small panes, the old kind, and they caught the afternoon light in a way that made the house look inhabited, even with the lights off, as if the building itself contained something warm. A stone path led from the gravel to the front steps, bordered on either side by what had clearly been planted beds, the shape still visible under the flattened winter growth. The lake was 40 yards from the front porch. A wooden dock extended out from a small rocky shore, its boards silvered with age, a rowboat tied at the near post and sitting perfectly still on the water. Adeline sat in the car and looked at it. This was not a lake house that was not worth the property taxes. This was not a wreck that would sell for $50,000 if she was lucky. This was a home, maintained, cared for, quietly tended. The porch railings did not paint themselves. The stone path did not keep itself clear. Someone had been here recently and consistently making sure this place was ready. She was still sitting in the car when she heard footsteps on the gravel behind her. An older woman was coming from the direction of the road, moving with the unhurried purpose of someone who knew exactly where they were going. Perhaps 70, solidly built, wearing a heavy canvas coat and carrying a paper bag in each arm. She walked directly to the driver's side of the car as Adeline stepped out. "You're Adeline," the woman said. "Not a question." "Yes, how did you know?" "Sylvester told us to watch for you, said you'd be driving a silver Honda coming from the coast." She shifted one bag to free a hand. "Wanda Hadley, I run the general store in town." She held out both bags. "Groceries, milk, eggs, bread, coffee, a few other things. The house is stocked for comfort, but not for eating." Adeline took the bags. "Sylvester told you I was coming. He told us he'd come eventually once he was gone." Wanda said it the way someone might describe the arrival of a predictable season. "He's been coming to this town for close to 30 years. Stopped in at the store nearly every visit. He talked about you more than he talked about anything else." Adeline looked back at the house, at the lake behind it, at the late afternoon light moving across the water. "He never mentioned this place to me," she said. "Not once." Wanda nodded slowly. "I know." He explained why. She paused. "Come on, I'll help you get the door open and show you around before the light goes." Wanda used the iron key from the brown envelope, sliding it into the lock with the ease of someone who had done it many times, and the front door opened onto a wide entrance hall with plank floors the color of dark honey. The wood had been maintained rather than refinished, which meant someone had been cleaning it and caring for it for years, and the difference showed in the grain. The main room opened directly from the hall. It was large and low-ceilinged, with exposed beams overhead and a stone fireplace on the far wall that occupied nearly the entire width of it. The furniture was simple and worn in the right ways: a long sofa in faded navy wool, 2 armchairs positioned near the hearth, a reading lamp on a side table with a book left face down on the arm of the nearest chair, as if someone had stepped out briefly and meant to return. Braided rugs and muted greens and grays lay across sections of the floor. Bookshelves lined the wall beside the fireplace, filled completely paperbacks, mixed with hardcovers, no apparent organizing principle, except that all of them had clearly been read. And on every available surface, the shelves and the mantel and the side tables and the window ledges were framed photographs. All of them were of Adeline. She walked toward the nearest shelf, slowly, the way you approach something you are not certain is real. The first photograph she recognized immediately. She was in the back garden of the Gloucester house, kneeling in the soil with her sleeves rolled up and her hair loose, laughing at something just outside the frame. She remembered that afternoon. She had been planting the first of the climbing roses, the deep red variety she had trained along the back fence over the following decade. She remembered the weight of the root ball in her hands and the smell of turned earth and the particular satisfaction of it. She had not known Sylvester was there. She had not known anyone was watching. The next was from a dinner party perhaps 15 years into their marriage. Adeline in conversation at the far end of a table, her hands moving the way they did when she was making a point. She felt strongly about, completely unaware of the camera. Then a photograph that stopped her entirely. She was on the porch of this house. Sitting on the porch she had just walked past, wrapped in a blanket, the lake visible in silver gray in the background. Her face was relaxed in a way it rarely looked in photographs she knew were being taken unguarded and at ease. She looked like a woman in the place she was supposed to be. She had no memory of ever being here. She had no memory of sitting on that porch. No memory of the blanket or the lake or the light. She had never been to Clover, New Hampshire. She had never stood on the shore of Ember Lake. She was certain of that, and yet there she was. "He brought you here twice," Wanda said from behind her quietly. "Both times you were asleep in the car when he arrived. He carried you in, let you sleep in the back bedroom, and drove you home before you woke up. You were never awake long enough to see the place." Adeline stood with the photograph in both hands and said nothing. "He said he wanted you to see it for the first time properly," Wanda continued, "when it was finally yours. He didn't want your first memory of it to be something that felt like a lie." The following morning, Adeline drove into Clover to the hardware and feed store on Birch Street. Wanda had mentioned it had said the owner knew about soil and growing things, and Adeline had looked out the window at the stone path borders and thought about what she might plant when the ground thawed. She needed something to do with her hands. She needed to think about something other than the brown envelope in the empty bedroom upstairs. The store was narrow and dim and smelled of fertilizer and cedar and the particular dusty warmth of a building that has been heated by the same system for 40 years. A man in his late 60s was reorganizing a shelf near the back, deliberate about it, in the way of someone for whom organization was a considered activity rather than a chore. Osgood Pruitt looked up when she came in. He had the kind of face that withheld judgment, slowly rather than quickly taking its time arriving at a conclusion. "You're the woman who moved into the Bancroft place," he said. "That's right." He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly social. "Sylvester talked about you," he said, "every time he came through. But I never saw you here before." He paused. "I wasn't sure," he said, "whether you were who he described." She met his gaze evenly. "He said I knew about soil." Osgood considered this. "He said you knew about growing roses." "Slightly acidic soil," she said. "Good drainage, 6 hours of direct sun minimum. The beds along the stone path look like they haven't been turned in the 2 seasons." Something in Osgood's expression settled the way a judgment that has been suspended finally lands somewhere. He turned back to the shelf he'd been working on. "Soil amendment is 2 rows over," he said. "Second shelf from the bottom. I'll be there in a minute." They spent nearly an hour talking about the beds and what they had once held and what they might hold again. Osgood was not a man who spoke more than the situation required, but when he did speak, he knew what he was talking about, and Adeline found herself genuinely interested in what he said. At some point, the conversation shifted the way conversations do when two people have gotten past the point of measuring each other. He told her about the scholarship fund Sylvester had quietly established for graduating seniors at the Clover High School, 3 students a year, no name attached to the award. He told her about the family on Maple Ridge Road whose mortgage Sylvester had paid off after the father lost his job the winter their youngest was sick. He told her about the church heating system that had been failing for years until one autumn it simply wasn't failing anymore, and how the congregation had eventually traced the repair back to Sylvester through an invoice that had been rerouted twice but not carefully enough. "He was the strangest man I ever knew," Osgood said, "and he didn't say it unkindly. Did all that and never wanted anyone to know." He looked at Adeline. "He never told you any of this, did he?" "It was not a question." "No," Adeline said. "He never told me any of it." Osgood nodded once, the slow nod of a man fitting a piece into a picture he had been looking at for years. "He talked about you every time he was here," he said. "Every single visit. And all this time he never told you this place existed." "That's right." Osgood was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think he wanted you to find it yourself. I think he wanted you to see it when it could be completely yours." He picked up a bag of soil amendment from the lower shelf and set it on the counter between them. "He was building something here," he said, "for a long time. I don't think he ever quite figured out how to say that to you while he was alive." Adeline drove back to the house on Lake Ridge Road in the late afternoon with the soil amendment in the back seat and Osgood Pruitt's words in her mind. She parked in the gravel and sat for a moment, the engine off, looking at the stone front of the house and the lake beyond it, the light on the water changing as the afternoon moved toward evening. Sylvester had been coming here for 30 years. He had maintained this house through 30 winters. He had carried her sleeping from a car and laid her in a bedroom and let her sleep and driven home before dawn so she would never know, so that her first real memory of this place would be the one she was making right now. He had paid for scholarships and mortgages and heating systems in a town he had never mentioned to her and had never taken credit for any of it. And he had stood beside her at 38 years of dinner parties and family gatherings and said nothing when his children treated her as a footnote in their father's life. Both of these things were true about him. She was going to have to learn how to hold them both. Wanda met her at the door that evening and led her through the rest of the house she had not yet fully seen. The kitchen with its farmhouse sink and copper pots, and the window above the worktop looking directly out at the lake. The dining room with its round oak table. 3 bedrooms upstairs, the largest with a window seat in the bay window and the lake visible from the pillow. At the end of the upstairs hallway was a narrow door Adeline had taken for a linen closet. Wanda opened it to reveal a staircase leading down to a room partially below ground level, a single small window looking out at the base of the pine trees. A study compact and deliberately arranged with built-in shelving on 3 walls holding document boxes and labeled folders in Sylvester's precise handwriting. A mahogany desk against the 4th wall, a green glass lamp, a leather chair pulled close. The room smelled of old paper and wood and something else, something that had no name, something that reminded her of the weight of a coat against her shoulder. On the center of the desk, positioned with clear deliberateness, was a cream envelope. Adeline Bancroft. Written in Sylvester's hand in full with the same care he had given to every birthday card and anniversary letter she had ever received from him. Never a shortened version of her name. Always the full thing because he had told her once that it was too good a name to shorten. Wanda touched her arm briefly. "I'll be downstairs," she said. "Take as long as you need." Adeline sat in Sylvester's chair, broke the wax seal on the envelope, and began to read. The letter was 6 pages long, written on both sides of 3 sheets of his heavy cream stationery, the handwriting smaller and more compressed than she was used to, as if he had rationed the space against the weight of what needed to be said. "My dear Adeline," he had written, "if you are reading this, you found the house, which means you found the key, which means the worst part is already behind you. I am sorry for that part. I am sorry for all of it, but especially for that. Sitting in Stuart Cromwell's office, hearing your name attached to language, I wrote deliberately to wound you, even knowing that you would eventually understand why, is the thing I am most ashamed of in the way I handled all of this." She read the words about the property first. 61 acres along the eastern shore of Ember Lake. The deed in her name, since 1997, transferred quietly during the period when Merton had retained legal counsel to review the estate, moved before he found it structured, so that it could not be challenged. The value, the legal architecture, Stuart's involvement, the clarity and permanence of her position. She set the pages down on the desk. She looked at the wall in front of her for a long time. Then she read the rest. What he had built over 30 years of financial consulting was not gossip. It was not speculation. It was documentation dated and organized and cross-referenced with the same methodical precision he brought to everything. Records of transactions and arrangements involving prominent families across New England. Correspondence. In some cases, photographs of signed agreements that certain parties would have substantial motivation to keep out of any public proceeding. A folder for each of his children labeled filed current. He had never used any of it. That had never been the point. But he had kept it carefully and kept it current because he had understood from early in his career that information held with discipline was the most durable protection a person could build. It was hers now. Adeline put the letter down and opened the filing cabinet. The folder marked with Merton's name ran to 62 pages. She read all of it before midnight. Then she read the sections for Agatha and Baxter. When she finished, she sat in Sylvester's chair in the small underground study with the pine trees visible through the narrow window and the house quiet above her, and she understood exactly what she was holding and exactly what it meant. Sylvester had not abandoned her. He had spent 30 years building her a fortress. He had just never told her it existed. She was not sure yet how she felt about that. The gratitude was real, and underneath it, something else was also real. The specific kind of anger you feel not at betrayal, but at unnecessary suffering, At 38 years of dinners and dismissals in second rows at funerals that might have gone differently if the man who loved her had loved her loudly enough for his children to hear. Both things were true. She was going to have to learn how to hold them both. She turned off the desk lamp. She sat for another moment in the dark, listening to the silence of the house. Then she went upstairs, put the letter on the bedside table, and slept through the night for the first time since Sylvester died. 3 weeks after Adeline arrived in Clover, the phone call came that she had been half expecting since the day she left Stuart Cromwell's office. Colin Kimball called on a Tuesday morning from his office in Boston, and his voice had the particular quality of a man delivering news. He had been professionally trained to present without alarm, but could not entirely keep out of his tone. Merton had retained 2 attorneys and filed a formal challenge. The argument was that the Lakeridge Road property constituted a marital asset subject to equal distribution among the estate's beneficiaries, and that Sylvester's transfer of the deed in 1997 had been a deliberate attempt to conceal jointly held property. They were asking the probate court to reverse it. The filing had been made 4 days ago. Colin had wanted to verify the details before calling. Adeline was sitting at the kitchen table when she heard this. Through the window, Ember Lake lay flat and gray under an overcast March sky. A pair of mergansers worked the shallows near the dock with the unhurried focus of creatures for whom the weather was simply weather. She pulled the filing cabinet folder she had been reviewing the previous evening across the table and opened it while Colin was still talking. "I've been preparing for this since Sylvester and I filed the deed transfer," Stuart Cromwell told her when he called 20 minutes later. "The structure is solid, but Merton's attorneys are experienced, and they will work to make this expensive and exhausting before they concede anything. I want you to be clear about what you are choosing if you want to fight it." "I'm clear," Adeline said. She was. She had been clear since she finished reading the 62 pages 2 nights ago and sat in Sylvester's underground study, understanding precisely what 3 decades of careful documentation meant in practical terms. She spent that evening reading the folder a second time, not for information, but for comprehension, the way you read something important twice, so that it becomes part of how you think rather than just something you know. 2 days after Colin's call, a black SUV came down Lakeridge Road and stopped in the gravel in front of the house. Adeline was in the garden when she heard it crouched at the near bed with a hand trowel turning the soil she had amended the week before. She had found bulbs beneath the winter debris dormant, but intact, and she was working around them carefully. She heard the car door and stood brushing the dirt from her knees. The man who came toward her was perhaps 32, in a suit that belonged in a city and shoes that did not belong on gravel at all. He walked with the forward momentum of someone accustomed to environments that responded to his arrival. "Connor Abernathy," he said. "I represent Merton Bancroft." Adeline pulled off one garden glove, then the other. "I was hoping we might speak informally," he said, "before this becomes more complicated for everyone involved. My client is prepared to discuss a settlement arrangement that could avoid a lengthy court process, something that would provide you with financial security while also allowing the family to move forward." Adeline looked at him steadily. "You came to my property without an appointment," she said, "to represent the interests of the man who is currently contesting my legal ownership of that property, and you're describing this as an informal conversation." Connor Abernathy opened his mouth and seemed to recalibrate. "Mrs. Bancroft, if we could just—" "No," she said. "Call Stuart Cromwell." She pulled the front door closed behind her. Through the window beside the door, she watched him stand in the gravel for a moment, looking at the house, and then walk back to his car. She watched the SUV reverse down Lakeridge Road until it disappeared behind the tree line. Then she went to the phone and called Stuart. "Tell Merton's attorneys," she said, "that before they file anything further, they may want to have a conversation with their client about a consulting arrangement he entered into in 2019 involving a real estate investment fund and 3 limited partners. I can provide the names in writing if that would be helpful. I can also provide documentation going back 20 years. Tell them I have no interest in using any of it, and tell them I will use all of it without hesitation if this continues." There was a silence on Stuart's end that lasted long enough to mean something. "Should I ask how you came to know about the 2019 arrangement?" he said finally. "Sylvester kept records of everything," Adeline said. "You know that better than anyone." "I'll make the call," Stuart said. The legal challenge was withdrawn 4 days later. No statement, no counter-proposal, no acknowledgement. It simply disappeared from the court record the way pressure disappears when a valve is opened completely and without ceremony. Adeline learned this from Colin on a Wednesday afternoon. She was standing in the kitchen when he called, looking out at the lake. She thanked him, set the phone down on the counter, and went back to what she had been doing, which was chopping vegetables for a soup she intended to eat over the next 3 days. The relief she felt was not dramatic. It was more like the absence of something she had been carrying without fully registering the weight of it, a loosening in the shoulders, a breath that went a little deeper than the ones before it. The next morning, she drove to Osgood's store and bought another flat of soil amendment and 2 packets of seeds she had been thinking about since her first visit. Osgood rang her up without unnecessary conversation, which she had come to appreciate about him. And at the door, she stopped. "Did he ever say why he didn't tell me about this place?" she asked. Osgood looked up from the register. "Sylvester, you mean?" "Yes." Osgood thought about it. "He said once that he wanted there to be somewhere in the world that was purely yours, that everything else in your life had been built around other people's needs, and he wanted to build something around yours without you having to watch it being built or feel grateful for it while it was happening." He said by the time he understood that it was too late to explain it without it sounding like an excuse. Adeline held the seed packets in both hands. "That sounds like him," she said. Osgood nodded. "He also said he was afraid you wouldn't accept it if he offered it directly. He said you weren't built to receive things, only to give them." She drove home on that and thought about it for the rest of the afternoon. 10 days after the legal withdrawal, a black SUV appeared on Lake Ridge Road on a Saturday, and this time Agatha's car followed it. Adeline watched from the upstairs window as all three of them stepped out and stood in the gravel looking at the house. She watched the moment their expectations met the reality of what they were seeing, the clean porch railings and the stone facade, and the lake beyond, the evidence that this was not the liability they had been dismissing for months. She watched the small recalibrations move across their faces, Merton's jaw setting slightly, Agatha's posture straightening in a way that meant she was reassigning value, Baxter standing slightly apart from the other two, his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the water rather than the house. She let them knock before she came downstairs. She opened the door and looked at them standing on her porch. "Come in," she said. "I'll make tea." She served them in the living room using the good china she had found in the kitchen cabinet. She poured without hurrying and set each cup down in front of each of them with the unhurried ease of a woman entirely comfortable in the space she occupied. She let the silence settle for a moment before she sat down in the armchair nearest the fireplace and looked at them. "We wanted to talk about the situation directly," Merton said. "Person to person, we feel there may have been decisions our father made that weren't fully thought through, and a reasonable conversation between adults could," Merton Adeline said. He stopped. "I have 62 pages of documentation about your business activities that your father maintained for 20 years. She said it without heat, the way you state a fact you have verified and are certain of. I have comparable records on both of your siblings. I have no interest in using any of it. I have never had any interest in using it. But I will without hesitation if any one of you challenges my ownership of this property again or makes any effort to complicate my life in any form going forward." The room held the sound of the lake wind against the glass. "Your father left you what he intended to leave you. The conditions on your trusts are legal and permanent." She looked at each of them in turn, not with triumph, not with anger, just with the clarity of a woman who has finished a long calculation and arrived at the number. "You came here expecting to find someone who could be managed. I understand that, but I want you to leave here knowing something clearly. I am not desperate, I am not afraid of you, and I am not going anywhere." Agatha opened her mouth. For a moment, something moved across her face that Adeline did not expect. Not calculation, not coldness, but something older and less organized. Something that looked for just that one unguarded second, like exhaustion. Not the exhaustion of the morning, but the kind that has been accumulating for years and doesn't have anywhere to go. Then it was gone, replaced by the composed surface Adeline had known for 35 years, and Agatha closed her mouth without speaking. Baxter put his untouched tea back on the table and looked out the window at the lake. Merton stood first, buttoning his coat with the practiced movements of a man who had learned long ago to perform composure when he did not feel it. "We'll be in touch through Stuart," he said. "You're welcome to," Adeline said. "He knows where to find me." She watched their cars move down Lake Ridge Road from the front porch, standing in the cold without her coat, and felt something settle in her chest that had been unmoored for months. Not victory, Something quieter than that and more permanent, the feeling of a door closing on a room you no longer need to enter. She went inside, washed the teacups, and started dinner. 15 minutes later, there was a knock at the door. Not the sound of the two cars returning. A single knock, hesitant, the knock of someone who is not certain they have the right to be standing there. Baxter was on the porch alone. His car was still in the gravel, which meant he had let Merton and Agatha leave without him. He was not wearing the composed expression he had worn in the living room. He looked the way he had looked at the funeral, uncertain and younger than his years. "I didn't come with them," he said. "I mean, I rode with Agatha, but this wasn't my idea." He stopped, started again. "I just wanted to say that I'm sorry. For the will reading, for all of it. I know that doesn't cover what it needs to cover." Adeline looked at him for a moment. He was 48 years old, and he had never quite grown out of the boy who had decided at 18 that she was the reason his family had broken. And she had watched him carry that story for 3 decades, watched it make him smaller in ways he probably didn't understand. She opened the door wider. "Do you want more tea?" she said. He came in and sat at the kitchen table and looked out at the lake. He didn't say much more. He didn't try to explain the years or justify the absences or reconstruct a history that had gone the way it went. He just sat there with the lake going gray in the late afternoon light, and Adeline made tea she didn't think either of them would drink much of, and they sat in the kitchen together without needing it to be more than what it was. He said at some point, "I think he loved this place because it was the only place he could think about you without it being complicated." Adeline looked at her cup. "That sounds about right," she said. Baxter left an hour later. He paused at the door and looked back at the house, the kitchen light warm through the window, the lake visible behind. Then he got in his car and drove down Lake Ridge Road, and Adeline watched until the headlights disappeared. She did not know what would come after that. She did not spend time trying to predict it. Some doors, when they open, take their own time. Spring arrived the way it arrives in northern New England, with argument and then sudden surrender. Through March, the lake stayed iron gray, and the mornings required a fire before the house warmed through. Then one week in mid-April, the ice along the shore pulled back overnight. The birch trees on Lake Ridge Road put out their first tentative green, and Ember Lake turned a shade of blue that Adeline had not seen before and could not have described accurately, except to say that it was the color of a decision that has finally been made. She had been in clover for 6 weeks by then, and the shape of her days had become something she had not anticipated. She woke early not from anxiety, but from a genuine interest in the morning, in the light on the water, in the heron that sometimes worked the shallows near the dock, in the particular quality of the air before the day fully established itself. She made coffee and took it to the front porch, regardless of temperature, and held the cup with both hands and watched the lake. She had started gardening again. The beds along the stone path had good structure beneath the winter damage, and she had spent 3 weeks in late March clearing the dead growth and turning the soil before the planting could begin. Osgood had helped her think through what might work given the light and the drainage and the particular character of the soil on the eastern shore of Ember Lake. He was not a man who offered help readily, but he gave it fully once he decided it was warranted. And Adeline had found in him something she had not expected to find in Clover, or anywhere else, a person who engaged with her ideas on their merits, rather than filtering them through who she was or had been. She was, for the first time in 38 years, known as herself alone. Not as Sylvester Bancroft's wife, or the woman who ran his household so well that people complimented him on it. Just as Adeline, the woman in the stone house on Lake Ridge Road, the one who knew about soil and had read widely and thought carefully and had things worth saying. It was a stranger feeling than she had expected. Lighter and also more work, because there was no architecture to lean on, no established role to fill. She had to be a person from the ground up, which was more demanding and more alive than anything she had done in a very long time. Maud Baxter had been bringing her into things gradually since the 3rd week. First, the Tuesday reading group at the library, 6 women working through a stack of novels that had been accumulating since autumn. Then an invitation to the Historical Society's spring lecture, which turned out to be more interesting than the title suggested. Then coffee at Maud's house on a Thursday morning that lasted until noon. Maud was 70, a retired schoolteacher who had taught English literature for 32 years at the regional high school and had opinions about books that were worth arguing with. She had been divorced for 12 years, a fact she mentioned without drama and without the performed resilience that people sometimes apply to difficult histories like a coat of paint. She simply lived with the truth of it, which Adeline had come to understand was its own kind of strength. On a Thursday in late April, after the others had left the reading group and they were stacking chairs in the library meeting room, Maud said, "You're still angry at him, aren't you?" It was not a question. Adeline set a chair down. "Yes," she said. "Good," Maud said. She picked up another chair. "The anger means you know what it cost. The problem is when the anger is the only thing you keep." Adeline was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He built all of this for me, 30 years. He just never figured out how to also stand up for me while he was alive." Maud nodded. She had the quality of someone who could hear a hard thing without flinching from it or rushing to cover it with comfort. "That's a real loss," she said. "Both of those things can be true about a person. The love can be genuine and the failure can also be genuine. You don't have to choose which one to believe." Adeline had been thinking about that since the morning she read Sylvester's letter in the underground study and set the pages down and sat in the dark of his chair and felt gratitude and fury existing in the same space inside her chest. She had been carrying the question of how two such different things could both be true about the same man and the same 38 years and what it meant to accept that they were. What Maud offered was not an answer. It was permission to stop looking for one. She found the second envelope on a Sunday afternoon in early May, 2 months after arriving in Clover. She had been working through the contents of Sylvester's desk drawer by drawer, not rushing it, taking an hour here and there, when she felt ready to handle the careful organization of a man's inner life. The bottom left drawer held the leather-bound address book she had been meaning to go through, and beneath it slid to the very back of the drawer with the particular placement of something that was meant to weight a sealed envelope. Her name on the front in Sylvester's hand. "For what comes next, open when you are ready." She sat down in his chair and held it for a moment before opening it. Inside was a deed to a 2-acre parcel on the north end of Clover. A small timber frame building on it formerly used as a workshop paid in full, entitled in her name. Alongside of it, a trust document. $100,000 established and funded, designated by a line in Sylvester's handwriting, for whatever Adeline decides to build with the rest of her life. She read that line 3 times. Not a direction, not a suggestion, not the careful language of a man hedging against outcomes, whatever Adeline decides. He had left the answer blank deliberately because he had understood that the answer was not his to fill in. She sat with the envelope in her lap and looked out the narrow study window at the base of the pine trees and thought about Osgood saying he was afraid you wouldn't accept it if he offered it directly. He said you weren't built to receive things, only to give them. She thought about 38 years of giving and what it had accumulated into and what it meant that a man who had known her better than anyone had spent 3 decades quietly building her the conditions to stop. Then she called Wanda. What she built over the following year was not a formal institution. It had no clinical name and no accreditation and no brochure. It was a gathering place which is different from a program, and the difference matters. The timber frame building on the north end of town had good bones and a concrete floor and 2 large windows that caught the morning light from the east. And Adeline spent 3 months working with a local contractor to make it into a space that felt like a place a person could think. Good chairs, a working kitchen with a long table, a garden outside the east window that she planted herself. Bookshelves along 2 walls filled over time with books from her own collection and donations from the Clover Library's surplus and titles that members brought in and left behind. A wood stove in the corner that made the room genuinely warm in winter, in the way that only a wood stove does through the body rather than the air. She called it Ember House after the lake that had been waiting for her without her knowledge for 3 decades. The first group of 8 women arrived on a Saturday morning in early September. They ranged in age from 54 to 81. Some had lost husbands. Some had outlasted marriages that had exhausted them. Some had simply arrived at a point in their lives where the structures that had organized their time for decades had fallen away. Children-grown careers ended, and they were standing in the space left behind without a clear idea of what to do with it. They sat around the big table in the main room, and the conversation started slowly. The way conversations start when people are not yet certain what is safe to say, and then it found its own current and ran for 4 hours without stopping. Maud Baxter was the first to arrive that morning, carrying a coffee cake she had made at 6 and a canvas bag full of the novels they had been discussing in the Tuesday group. Wanda came third, setting her coat over the back of a chair and sitting down as naturally as if she had been there before, which in a sense she had, because the idea had been hers and Adeline's and Osgood's and Maud's and everyone's at once, the way things become when a community has been waiting for them without knowing the right name. Adeline made the coffee. She sat at the table with the others. She was not the host in the sense of being the person at the center of things. She was one of the people at the table, which was the only role that had ever suited her, and the one she had been denied most consistently for the 38 years before she drove 3 hours northwest and found a stone house she had never seen with her own face on every shelf. The conversation moved through many things that morning: books and seasons and difficult marriages and adult children, and the particular quality of time when you are past 60 and the days feel both shorter and more spacious than they did before. It moved through the practical, through what to do with a house that has too many rooms for one person, through the question of how to remain relevant in a world that has decided on your obsolescence. It moved through the tender and the funny, and occasionally the raw, and nobody rushed anyone past anything. Adeline listened more than she spoke. She had always been better at listening, and she understood now that this was not a deficiency she needed to correct. It was a form of attention that had value, the capacity to be fully present with another person's reality without needing to redirect it toward yourself. She had been doing that for 38 years in a household that had not noticed or acknowledged it. Here it was, the entire point. On an afternoon in late September, after the group had been meeting for 3 weeks and the rhythm of it had become something all of them relied on, Adeline walked down to the dock alone. The meeting had ended an hour before, and the last car had pulled out of the gravel lot behind the building, and the evening was coming on cool and clear, the kind of September evening in New England that carries in it the full knowledge of winter ahead without being diminished by it. She sat at the end of the dock with her feet over the water and took Sylvester's letter from the pocket of her jacket where she had been carrying it since the morning she first read it. She did not open it. She had not needed to open it in some time. She knew every line. She held it in both hands and looked at the lake. The light was going off the water in the particular way it goes in late September. The gold flattening to copper and then to something quieter. A reflection of sky more than sun. A loon called from the far shore, a single long note that crossed the water and dissolved into the tree line. She thought about 30 years of monthly trips, Sylvester driving up through the changing seasons, to a house on the eastern shore of a lake, in a small New Hampshire town, sitting in the underground study, or on the covered porch, or at the round oak dining table, thinking about a woman who was 3 hours away, managing a household and a family, and a life built entirely around other people's needs, not knowing he was here, not knowing this existed. She thought about what Osgood had said. He wanted there to be somewhere in the world that was purely yours. She thought about the photographs. All those photographs. The one in the garden with her sleeves rolled up and her hair loose, laughing at something she couldn't see. The one on this very porch with the blanket around her shoulders, her face the way it looked when no one was watching. The face of a woman at ease, which is something different from a woman at rest, because ease requires a particular quality of safety, the feeling that the place you occupy in the world is legitimate and permanent and yours. He had seen that in her. He had caught it again and again across 38 years with a camera and a careful eye, and he had brought every one of those images to this house and arranged them on every surface, building a record of a woman being fully herself, because he had known that she needed proof of it, even if she didn't know she needed it yet. She understood now why he had not told her while he was alive. Not entirely, not in a way that made his silence forgivable, but in a way she could hold alongside the love, without one canceling the other. He had been afraid that explaining it would make it a transaction, that offering the house would make her feel managed rather than protected, and so he had kept it building in silence. And the silence had cost her more than he understood until it was too late to undo. She was still angry about that. She thought she might always be a little. The anger had a shape now, though a contained and specific shape, rather than the formless pressure that had been with her since February. It fit beside the love without crowding it. She was 66 years old. She had arrived in Clover with 2 suitcases and an iron key and $20 in a checking account, in a marriage that had turned out to be something both larger and more complicated than she had known. She had found a house full of her own face and a letter written by a man who had loved her imperfectly and prepared for her perfectly, and never quite bridged the distance between the two. She had found a town that had known her name for 30 years before she knew it existed. She had found a table where 8 women sat and talked for 4 hours, and none of them had to be anyone other than exactly who they were. She put the letter back in her pocket. The loon called again from the far shore, and the sound came across the water clean and unimpeded in the evening air. Ember Lake held the last of the light on its surface, not reflecting it exactly, but absorbing it and returning it changed the way water does, the way time does, the way a life does, when you finally stop moving through it and allow yourself to arrive somewhere. Adeline sat on the dock in the cooling air and let the evening come, and she did not feel at the end of anything. She felt for the first time in a very long time exactly at the beginning.